Hi everybody, this is David, and today I want to go through the letter of Paul to Philemon. So I'm just going to jump right into this. I picked this letter to do first because it's so short. So look at this, 25 verses. You can knock this thing out so quickly. So I think it's a great place to start. Anyway, as we're starting, I kind of want to point out the structure of a typical Greek-Roman letter. This is the way most letters work. In fact, I'm going to pull up something here so you guys can follow with me. I meant to do this earlier. But anyway, here's a Greek letter that's not a part of the Bible. This is just a regular guy. This is actually a soldier writing to his dad. This guy named Appian just joined the Roman military, and he's writing to his dad, and he just wants to check in with him. And I want to point this out so you can see the similarities between just a standard, typical son-to-father letter and the way Paul writes his letters in the New Testament. In this case, this young man's name is Appian, and his father is Epimachus. And he says, his father and Lord, very many greetings. That's a cool way of greeting your dad. And notice that he starts off with a prayer for his father. Before all else, I pray that you are well and that you may prosper in continual health. And then a thanksgiving. I give thanks. Well, in this case, Serapis is a pagan god. But you get the idea, because while I was in danger at sea, he rescued me immediately. So you have a prayer and thanksgiving, and then you have the actual body here. When I arrived at Misenum, I don't know where that is, I received this traveling money from Caesar, 10 gold pieces. Good going, Appian. And, he talks a little bit more, and then finally at the end, it's the conclusion of the letter. Salute, Capitan, very much, and my siblings, and Serenalia, and my friends. I sent you my portrait through this other guy, Euctemenos, and my name is Antonius Maximus. That's an awesome name. Why would he be telling his dad his own name? Well, because presumably when he joined the military, they weren't going to accept his Egyptian name Appian, so they were going to change it. He had to get a new name, Antonius Maximus, which is cool anyway, so good for him. I pray that you are well, and he tells his dad that he's part of the company Athenike, which, Nike stands for victory. I actually don't know what Athens means, so that's awkward. Sorry. Anyway, I'm just trying to show you what a Greek letter looks like. And what we're really trying to get at is here in Philemon, you have a standard Greek letter. It's Paul. The first word is the name of the author. There's self-description of the author and who he's writing to, which is, in this letter, it's kind of interesting. There you've got the first name is a guy named Philemon, and then also, lesser known, Apphia and Archippus, as well as to the church in your house. So we know Paul, of course. This is the famous Apostle Paul. We haven't really heard of this guy named Philemon or Apphia or Archippus, and then of course we don't know specifically the church in his house, but that's who it's written to. I'll tell you right off the bat that I'd say the majority of teachers think that it's written specifically to Philemon, although there is good debate that it might have been written to Archippus. I'm not going to get into that today, but in general, I'm just going to say that Paul is writing to Philemon. I'll explain why in a second. But just kind of giving you a tip that or a hint that if you're interested in looking into this a little more closely, when you read the commentaries, excuse me, some people think that Paul is really trying to get to this guy named Archippus. I'll explain why in just a second. Then you've got your, your little prayer and thanksgiving right here. I thank God always, making mention of you in my prayers. So that's that. Okay. So let me give you a general idea of what's happening in this letter before I go in verse by verse. It seems like Paul is writing to Philemon. Now that's up for debate, and I'll explain why. What's happened is there's another character named Onesimus. Onesimus, by the way, is it's kind of like calling somebody useful. There's a little play on words there. Now, Onesimus seems to be a slave, and the fact that he is writing to Philemon seems to indicate that Onesimus was Philemon's slave. Now, as we go through this, we'll be able to reconstruct what's happening here and what is probably happening. Keep in mind that it's not 100% clear, but it's pretty clear. What's happening is that it seems that Onesimus ran away or somehow is away from Philemon, has met Paul, has changed his life, and now needs to go back to Philemon to get forgiveness. And if Paul's letter comes through, maybe even Onesimus will get to go free. Now, it's not just that's what Paul's letter is doing here. He's asking Philemon to let Onesimus go free, but not just to go free and do his own thing. Paul is asking for Onesimus to go free so that Onesimus can come and help Paul. Now that Paul's an old man, he needs a lot of help, and it seems like Onesimus has been helping Paul. So all that is what's occurring here. To boil this down, it seems like Paul is writing on the behalf of Onesimus to ask Philemon, who is Onesimus' slave master, will you please let Onesimus go free so he can come serve me, Paul, as I'm an old man. That's the gist of it. Now, let's walk through this verse by verse and make this a little clearer. In verse 4 starts, the prayer and thanksgiving has started reading, and I think Paul is already hinting at the fact that, I don't want to say he's buttering him up, but he's pretty much trying to get this guy, pointing out that Philemon is a good guy. You have love towards all the saints. I think he's trying to point out that Philemon's a good guy and he loves all Christians. Why is he saying that up front? Well, because it turns out Onesimus isn't just a slave, he's a Christian slave. And so if Philemon, he loves all the saints, he should also show love towards Onesimus. I think that's his point there. Oopsie daisies. Paul himself, he says, I've come to much joy and comfort because of you, and because and the hearts of the saints have been refreshed through you, brother. So again, pointing out how good a guy Philemon is. Now comes the kind of the twisting of the arm, and you'll see Paul, and I think a lot of people are surprised that Paul comes on so strong, and I don't want to say manipulative, I don't think that's the right word, but really he's going to put a lot of pressure on Philemon. He says here in verse 8, I have confidence in Christ, and I could order you to do what you should do. And what he hasn't gotten into it, but he means let Onesimus go free. Paul says, I could order you to do this, but for love's sake, I would rather appeal to you. I'd rather ask you, since I am a person such as Paul, I'm old now, and I'm a prisoner of Christ Jesus. He probably doesn't mean prisoner as in a metaphorical prisoner of Christ, the way you and I would use it. We're slaves to Jesus, or prisoners is what I meant to say. We would say that in a metaphorical sense. In this case, Paul is actually probably in prison, in some jail somewhere, and he's old, and he's appealing to Philemon's love, which Paul's already mentioned. He knows that Philemon is a loving person, loves the saints, he's always taking care of people. And so he's saying in verse 8, I could order you to do this, but because of the love we have for each other, and I think in a big sense, because of the love Paul knows Philemon has for him, he's going to ask as an old man who's in jail. What's his request? Well, here's in verse 10. I appeal to you for my child Onesimus, whom I have begotten in my imprisonment. So what does it mean that he has begotten him in his imprisonment? Well, I think the first thing, the most obvious, or maybe the first guess we would jump at, is that Onesimus has become a believer. And so if that's the case, then a lot of people think that Onesimus ran away from Philemon, for whatever reason, ran into Paul. It could just be a total coincidence. And that when he ran into him, Paul shared the gospel with Onesimus. Excuse me. And now Onesimus is a Christian. Well, that's definitely a possibility. Some scholars have pointed out, and people who are much more brilliant than I am have caught this, that Paul calls his children people who he didn't necessarily lead to the Lord. And one potential person is Timothy. He calls Timothy his son. Well, Timothy he didn't lead to the Lord. So it's not necessarily what I meant to say is when Paul says I've begotten him in my imprisonment, he may not necessarily mean he led him to the Lord. Perhaps he means maybe they formed a special mentor-mentee relationship or something like that. Regardless, whatever happened, what we can say that's true is that their relationship changed so that Paul is over Onesimus in some spiritual sense. Now, Paul goes on to say, Onesimus was formerly useless to you, and now he's useful. This is a play on word on Onesimus, which means useful. Paul says, he used to be useless to you. I'm not entirely sure why Paul is saying that Onesimus used to be useless. It could possibly be that Onesimus was just a terrible slave and just not very good, and now now as a believer he's useful. Another possibility is Philemon as a non-believer, if he wasn't saved yet. He would have been useless in an eternal sense, and now he's useful in an eternal sense. So that's possible. I'm going to say that my guess, and this is not the majority of teachers here, but my guess is that and I'm stealing this from a good friend of mine, by the way, Jordan Almanzar, so this is not original to me, but my guess is that that Onesimus, because he was his slave, and slaves basically had to follow the religion of their fathers or their owners. Since Philemon was a Christian, Onesimus, the slave, must have been to some degree a Christian, and that now he's either become a real Christian, like maybe the Christianity he had under Philemon wasn't a real Christianity, and now he's become truly converted. Or maybe in some way, people are believers but not truly living out the Christian life, and maybe that's changed with Paul, and that seems possible. But whatever's happening here, there's a change. There's a big change where Philemon or Onesimus is now really useful to both Paul and to Philemon. That's what he says, you, in the sense that he's as a believer, Philemon is going to sort of be given Onesimus, and Onesimus will be, I guess in a sense, Philemon will be serving Paul vicariously through Onesimus. And I think that's possible. Well, check this out. I have sent him back to you in person. We have letters from ancient Greek where a slave gets in trouble with his master and he runs away to another master and asks, this other guy who's a friend of his master back at home, can you please beg my master for mercy on my behalf? And that's a kind of a tricky situation, and I think that's kind of showing that slaves weren't just dogs. They're not just property, but apparently, they're not quite, free human beings. But in this world, that's a part of life, and it would have been an awkward part of life where your rich friend, his slave runs to you and he's begging you, please beg him. And it's interesting. There is a letter where that actually happens, and we have that letter to this day, where a man writes to his friend saying, "Hey, your slave came to me. He told me what happened. I've admonished him. I've warned him that I'm never going to stand up for him again. But I'm begging you on his behalf, on this slave's behalf, please show mercy, receive him back. He's assured me he's never going to mess us up again." So that happens, and it's kind of interesting that Paul seems to be doing that here again. And notice how Paul words it. I am sending you my very heart. Basically, Paul is admitting vulnerability here. Onesimus isn't just a helper. Paul loves this guy. Paul loves Onesimus, and he's saying, I sent him back to you. Now, Philemon, as a slave owner, would have been perfectly within his rights to kill this guy or punish him physically severely. And so by sending him back, Paul is admitting that he's doing something that makes Paul himself extremely vulnerable, because he would hate for something horrible to happen to Onesimus. And so he's just admitting, listen, I'm sending this guy back, but not just as a slave. I'm sending my own heart, so please don't hurt him. Verse 13, I wish I could keep him here on my behalf so he can keep ministering to me while I'm in prison, but I couldn't do it without your consent. And here's Paul's rationale. I want you to do it from your own free will. I want you to do this as a service to me. So notice that Paul is, on the one hand, he could order Philemon to do this. The relationship between them must be something of an apostle and a pastor, or maybe something like a congregation. But Paul could order him to do it, and instead, notice he's just appealing to this guy, saying, I'm in prison, I'm in a tough situation, I could have just kept him for myself, but I wanted you to do this because you love me, I'm an old guy, I'm in prison. And here's verse 15, here's a part that kind of fills in a little bit of the gap. He says, maybe this is why he was separated you for a while. This is why a lot of pastors and teachers think that Philemon or Onesimus ran away from Philemon because he said he was separated from him. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Maybe Philemon ran away, and this is why. The conclusion is so that you would have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but more as a slave, as a brother. That's awkward. In this world, within Christianity today, we call each other brother and sister, and that's fine. But in a world, in a class system, to call somebody a brother when they're a slave and you're an owner, you're a freed owner, and who knows what Philemon's real position was. I mean, maybe he's even more than just a freed man. Maybe he's a very successful person, or maybe a politician, who knows. To call him a brother, that would have been, that is definitely a major statement. So then, if you regard me as a partner, accept him the way you've accepted me. And if he's wronged you, or if he owes you anything, charge it to my account. And I think Paul is literally saying, I will pay you for anything he owes you. Um, Paul's in prison, though, so he probably doesn't have any money. He's probably really hurting for cash. Um, but Paul is saying, I'll be indebted. And it's, I don't want to call it a guilt trip, but it's hard not to call it that, Here's the Apostle Paul nearing the end of his life, and he's saying, charge me, put it on my tab, and I'll pay you. When he probably doesn't have any money. Anyway, Paul, at this point, he begins writing with his own hand. Paul does this in a few different letters, and I guess if you didn't know this before now, you got to know now. Paul himself didn't write his own letters. Other people wrote them. If you Google Tertullius, actually I might be forgetting his name here, but at the end of Romans, we find out, I think it's Tertius actually. Tertius. Tertius wrote this letter. Paul doesn't write his own letters, and in fact, that's normal. He only, he only writes in his own hand, like a single verse. Now here's where this happens at the end of 1 Corinthians. Paul writes in his own, this greeting is in my own hand, Paul. And so Paul does that. He also does it in another passage. These are all the passages. I want to take you to Galatians 6:11 because here Paul says, "See with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand." So at this part, Paul decides to write in his own hand. And when you had a scribe do the writing, they were professionals and they wrote small to preserve, to keep that. The costs down by writing on less paper. Well, Paul wrote with his own hand when he wanted to make a statement, and that's what he's doing in Philemon. He's writing with his own hand. This is another major statement on Paul's behalf. We know that Paul probably had something wrong with his eyes because in Galatians he mentions something is wrong with his eyes. But so for Paul to write in his own hands, I will repay it. He's making a major statement. It would have probably tugged at the heart of anybody who is looking at that first copy. Yes, brother, let me benefit from you. Refresh my heart. And then he says, having confidence in your obedience, you're going to do what I say. I know that you will do even more than what I am asking for. So that's again another twist. And I love how he ends this letter. While you're doing that, also prepare a lodging for me. So he's going to go visit. And I think, if everything Paul has done up to this point doesn't seal the deal, Paul is saying, hey, by the way, also prepare a place for me when I get there. Saying, I'm going to show up. And so if Paul doesn't do this, or if Philemon doesn't answer or say yes to Paul's request, he's saying, by the way, I'm going to get there soon, so we're going to have a face-to-face conversation. Again, a pretty awkward one if Philemon doesn't obey him the way he says. Finally, he does a little name dropping. These people all knew each other, so of course they want to send greetings, little shout outs. Epaphras, my fellow prisoner, he's in jail with him. Also, Mark, is it the same Mark? Maybe, I don't know. Luke, this has got to be the same Luke as the gospel writer and the author of Acts. So here's a little cool shout out. And that's it. That's the conclusion of the letter. So here we have Philemon. Again, to kind of just summarize the whole letter in just a nutshell, Philemon is a letter from Paul to Philemon. And in that letter, Paul is requesting Philemon let one of his slaves go free, a slave named Onesimus. Apparently, Paul met Onesimus, changed his life in one way or the other, and now, as an old man imprisonment, Paul could really use an extra hand. And so he asked Philemon to let Onesimus go free so he can come and help Paul. And so there's a lot of guilt tripping and arm twisting at the end. Paul says, I know you're going to do it. Also, I'll visit you soon to prepare your spare bedroom for me because I'm going to spend some time with you. And all that should probably close the deal on this. By the way, there was a bishop of Asia Minor whose name is Onesimus. So we know him from, and it's around this time period. So there's a theory that Onesimus didn't just get to go free, but worked with Paul and eventually became an important church pastor and potentially even more than that, an overseer over several churches. So good for you, Onesimus. I'm glad things worked out for you. Again, that's all. I can't be certain about that, but still, kind of a fun, positive, happy ending, right? All right, well, I hope that was helpful, and let me know if you have questions, and I'll respond with video answers. Thanks.